Conflict between individuals, communities, and nations is inevitable. But at USIP, the United States Institute of Peace, we know conflicts can be resolved without resorting to violence. In fact, when conflicts are well managed, they can lead to transformative change for the better. But what does this actually mean? And what sets us apart as we pursue peace? We're a national, nonpartisan, independent institute that embodies America's commitment to peace. We've worked to become and remain a trusted expert in reducing conflict around the world. To disrupt cycles of violence and build sustainable peace, USIP works both from the bottom up with community, grassroots, and faith-based groups, and from the top down with leaders and governments. We're proactive, employing research and training that leads to action and makes communities and nations resilient to the forces that deal in violence and extremism. Our team works around the world, including in some of the most dangerous conflict zones. But we don't work alone. We partner with peace builders operating on the front line to build just and secure nations that can manage their own conflicts peacefully. We train communities to connect opposing sides using mediation, negotiation, and dialogue to bring nonviolent resolutions to conflict and build peace that lasts. Because we know that peace is practical, possible, and a process that is essential to saving lives and money. We all know that peace is hard, but at USIP, we believe it's worth it for our country and for the world.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and Ramadan Mubarak to those who are observing. My name is Scott Worden, and I am the Director of Afghanistan and Central Asia Programs for the U.S. Institute of Peace. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you here today for a very timely discussion on the Afghan peace process following the recent announcement by President Biden that U.S. troops will be leaving Afghanistan by September 11th of this year. This takes place with peace talks ongoing between the Taliban and the Afghan Republic, including the government in Doha. We also have the recent news just yesterday that a high-level conference about peace that was scheduled for Istanbul is being postponed because the Taliban refused to participate. We invite all of you to take part in today's discussion by following us through the Twitter hashtag #AfghanPeace, and also using the chat feature of the broadcast to raise questions, which we will ask of the panelists toward the end of the event. Since the beginning of the Biden administration, the world has really watched for the Afghan policy review to see what will be the direction of the U.S. regarding its true presence in Afghanistan and its future assistance. The Doha talks have been a breakthrough moment over the past 2 years, being the first time the Afghans are talking to each other about peace, although they really have not gotten started. And this week's most recent statement by the Taliban would seem to be a setback in that regard. We look forward to hearing from our panelists who represent both the negotiating team for Afghanistan, but also across civil society and experience with the U.S. government to give perspective on these recent events. USIP has a high priority to support an inclusive political settlement to the conflict that promotes stability and security for Afghanistan, as well as for the U.S. And we do this through comparative research on what makes peace processes work, especially difficult ones like Afghanistan. We conduct in-depth analysis of the drivers of conflict in Afghanistan, and we conduct on-the-ground programs through our Kabul office to engage with a wide range of Afghans, from the grassroots to political leadership, that identifies practical steps that can be taken to reduce conflict. So our panel here today is highly experienced and will offer their perspectives on the current situation. First, let me introduce Nader Nadri. He is a member of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan negotiation team. He also serves as the chairman of the Independent Administrative Reform and Civil Service Commission. And prior to joining that commission, he served as a member of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, and he was also chairperson of the Free and Fair Election Foundation of Afghanistan. Our next panelist will be Laurel Miller. She is the director of the International Crisis Group's Asia program. She previously served as a senior foreign policy expert at the RAND Corporation. And from 2013 to 2017, she was the deputy and then the acting special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan for the US State Department. Muqaddesa Yarish is the country director of Afghanistan for Lapis Communications, as well as an adjunct lecturer at the American University of Afghanistan. She previously served as the Deputy Minister for Commerce and Industry and has an extensive record of serving the Afghan government as well as engagement with the private sector. Hasib Humayun is the founding partner of Kara Group Afghanistan, which is a research, public affairs, and advisory firm. Over the past 2 decades, he's worked across Afghanistan with multiple domestic and international organizations on advancing human rights and civil liberties, as well as peace building. And finally, we are joined by Dipali Mukhopadhyay, who is part of the USIP team, and she serves as a senior expert on Afghanistan peace processes. She is also an associate professor in global policy at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School, and the author of the book, Warlords, Strongmen, Governors, and the State in Afghanistan, which I suspect is as relevant today as when she researched it in 2005. I will ask the panelists a series of questions, and we hope to get a lively discussion going, but we will also bring in questions from the audience that I will pose to the participants toward the second half of this hour-and-a-half session. And with that, let me kick things off with a question to Nader Naderi. As I said, we had momentous news from the Biden administration. We had a strong reaction, a negative reaction from the Taliban as far as peace talks are concerned. I'm interested in getting your reactions to the Biden decision. What do you think the impact will be on the peace process, but also on the Afghanistan political situation?
Thank you very much, Scott. Delighted to be here, seeing friends as part of the panel. The news of the withdrawal was not something new. There being discussion and deliberation about the withdrawal in the past at least couple of years, but more intensified in the past 6 months and in the past 4 months, especially with the new administration in place. However, what surprised a lot of people here was the unconditional element of the announcement of the withdrawal. That was one of the key elements or tool that could be used to utilize the space of the 4 months or less to get the Taliban engaged and continuously engaged in peace talks. The strategic ambiguity that was taken as approach in February by the United States and the rest of the NATO allies was somehow working in a way that the Taliban were not certain that if they do not engage in peace talks, that the troops would not withdraw. As we all know, a key element of the Taliban's objective was international forces withdrawal. And that was embedded in a way into the Doha Agreement that will create the right condition for the Taliban to engage in peace talks. Now, taking that condition and the announcement, of course, emboldened further a Taliban group that was already very much arrogant, emboldened, and very much, to an extent, toxic, intoxicated by this notion of victory, full victory. We've seen them since February, but especially since September, as we were engaging with them in Doha. That was a mantra that they would continue to raise and to talk about. They say the same thing and raise the same thing in an international fora in Moscow, where they said the time for peace is late. Therefore, it certainly have created additional conditions on the ground, especially here, but also on the table in Doha, where the Taliban have already halted talks in the past 10 days. They continue to feel that the path for them, for their second key goal, the establishment of a pure Islamic order is now possible, and therefore they can further wait, but not genuinely and meaningfully engage in talks that post-September they could unleash a full-fledged war against the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and the people of Afghanistan. So it certainly created new dynamics, but nothing was new. Certainly our government has respected and announced it. It respects the decision of the United States, and we have to prepare ourselves for what to come.
Thanks. You mentioned that their second goal, apart from U.S. troops leaving, is establishment of what they would call a pure Islamic system. You've been negotiating across from them. You've been interacting with them. Do you have any sense of what that means in practical terms as far as comparisons to the current constitution? What changes are they actually seeking in the current structure in concrete terms?
Well, in concrete terms, they have never shown any interest in engaging in discussing substantial issues related to the future, be it the political roadmap to a state that we have raised time and again. It's part of the agenda that both sides have shared late December with each other. They do not go into details of what kind of changes they would want. When asked by us, they responded simply, we don't want any changes to the current system. We want to start from scratch. We don't want any part of the current system. When you look to their ideology, political ideology about state and the governance, it first and foremost is driven by the fact that a small group of clergies will decide about the ultimate leader of the country, and that decision will be for lifetime. And therefore, democracy could not be reconcilable with that point of view. And the same thing goes toward other interpretations of this state. They kept telling us that they have had two, and they still have two key objectives, that the jihad that they were carrying out and they are carrying out is for those objectives. First, to get the international forces out of Afghanistan, and that's, they say, is happening, and they celebrate that as they have as a defeat of United States and the rest of the international community. The second part is to establish, as I say, of the pure Islamic order, and that has its own elements. Now, as part of that, we try to engage with them, and we still try to engage, and we hope that they engage with good faith, that Afghanistan today is an entirely different country. There are forces, not militarily only, apart from our national defense and security forces, the young generation of the society who have grown up in the past 20 years. The social, political, and civil forces here are not going to be easily giving up what they have got. And therefore, they may submit to whatever it takes for them to protect. And that's where I'm hopeful about it for our future also. While the announcement may have created some level of uncertainty, but it also created a good level of clarity on the way forward, some of which need to be further developed and discussed and shaped. But those issues, we engaged with the Taliban to understand the current realities of a transformed Afghanistan, where people like leaders like Muqaddasa or Hasib or hundreds of more, thousands of more in this country will stand, and they will stand firm to defend what they believe right. But the Taliban seems to still feel that they will wait, and they will try to test it if after the international troops withdrawal, if they can win militarily, and if they can't, then probably they think of a peaceful settlement or peace talks.
Thanks. And just building on that last point, ceasefire or reduction in violence has been one of the key short-term objectives of the talks. Do you fear that Biden's announcement will lead to an increase of violence? What do you see on that front?
We already see on the ground that there is an increase in a spike on on level of violence. Kabul was relatively calm in the past couple of months, but it's today again bombings have started. There are attacks in different parts of the country, and these are offensive attacks from the Taliban. The intelligence report that I reviewed recently in the past few days is an indicative of further mobilization and preparation for further wars. We also see reports where an influx of a larger number of foreign fighters returning back from Pakistan, especially in the area of Azra, of Logar, and in some parts of Paktika, and in some parts of Nangarhar. Those are certainly worrying signs, and those are not an indication for a faithful thinking about meaningful peace talks.
Thank you. Let me move to Laurel Miller. Laurel, obviously interested in your overall reactions to the Biden policy announcement, but maybe more specifically, I noted a tweet that Ambassador Khalilzad made in August of last year, defining U.S. objectives as seeking a sovereign, unified, and democratic Afghanistan that is at peace with itself and its neighbors and does not pose a threat to the world. Do you think that the Biden policy announcement is consistent with this goal? And I wonder also, how do you think, as Nader identified, it's the unconditional nature of the U.S. troop withdrawal? How does that affect the negotiating dynamic?
Thanks, Scott. I mean, I would regard the statement in that tweet, which is similar to things that American officials have said over many years, as being a statement of vision, not really a statement of policy or even of specific goals of policy. I think that's still a desirable vision from an American perspective, from an American national security perspective. But the way that I read President Biden's decision is he has made a judgment, a sort of calculation of American interests that separates what's desirable from what's essential from an American national security perspective, and that separates what's feasible, what's judged to be feasible to achieve from what is, something we would like to, not me, the U.S. government, from their perspective, would like to be able to achieve and keep working on. I think in a sense, it's not really a decision about Afghanistan. It's a decision about the United States and what its priorities are, and only a decision about Afghanistan insofar as the administration and the U.S. government is now looking at Afghanistan and the risks that it poses for U.S. national security in more of a comparative perspective than it has in the past. Risks are very difficult to compare across different contexts. And sometimes you're talking a bit about apples and oranges. How do you compare the risk of, potential resurgence of specific terrorist groups in Afghanistan to risks to the United States from a rising China? I mean, you can't really compare those kinds of risks and threats, but what you can compare is how much attention and how much in terms of resources does the United States think is required to attend to different problems around the world, and the decision that Biden made reflects a judgment call about that. I think it's the unconditional part of it that you mentioned is not terribly surprising to me. I think it shows that Biden was prepared to be much more decisive than his predecessors on questions about the future of the United States in Afghanistan. And I think it also reflects learning a lesson from the last two administrations in particular, which is if you're going to make a hard decision, if you don't make it early in your administration, it becomes harder to make. You're then, owning the problem, so to speak. And I think from the administration's perspective, if it couldn't see that circumstances were going to be greatly different in 1, 2, or 3 years from now, that there wasn't a reason. They were not looking out at a 10, 20-year time perspective. They were looking at a 4-year time perspective. And in that sense, if you can't say that the conditions are going to be, significantly different in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, then making a decision that hinged on changed conditions didn't make sense, looking at it from that perspective. And it's better to be decisive early than it is to drag it out over that period of time. My own view on the conditionality is that the Trump administration's deal that it made with the Taliban was conditional in name only. It was not really a conditional deal, either in the specific terms of what was written on paper or in the way that the administration conducted itself and the way that the president conducted himself on this issue. And so in that sense, I see actually more continuity than difference between the Biden and Trump administrations on the question of conditionality. Just saying something is conditional doesn't make it conditional if that's not what you've actually agreed and that's not the way that you're implementing your policy. My own view, a few years ago was that the only way to really get a peace process going near term was going to be to closely interlink the US Taliban questions with the intra-Afghan questions and have it all be of a piece, one package where, interweave them in a way that really would be conditional, both in terms of the negotiating process and also the substance of what was agreed. Once the Doha deal was signed and written in a way that really decoupled the question of a U.S. Taliban understanding on withdrawal from anything related to progress in the Afghan peace process, then I think that the window of opportunity to try to capitalize on that agreement for purposes of an Afghan peace process was just much too brief to be realistic. And so, I think the decision that's taken now, in a sense, was written over a year ago. Once that, and even before that, because there was obviously a lead up to that US Taliban agreement. And for Biden to have done otherwise would have been to completely undo what has already been done in the peace process. And that just imposed additional political and practical hurdles on how to move forward. We can talk a little bit more about leverage. What is there now? What's left? But let me turn back to you, Scott.
Yeah, well, that is really my next question. And I noted that in President Biden's speech, he was specific about not using the military as a bargaining chip in negotiations over Afghanistan's political future. And so that really crystallizes this question of, okay, if the troops are not, or even should not be, leverage in these talks, what leverage remains? And so how do you see the different elements of leverage from a U.S. or even a broader international perspective that would get to the end state, as you said, the aspirational goals that we seek?
Yeah. So I think in thinking about leverage, we have to distinguish between sort of tangible leverage and intangible leverage. The tangible leverage that the U.S. has had over time is the troop presence, because the significance of the troop presence is not so much a bargaining chip in the sense of it's, something you can just give away in exchange for certain actions in return. It's because the presence of American and NATO forces on the ground signifies an ability to force behavior or to potentially force behavior. The other element of tangible leverage is the money. The assistance that the United States provides to Afghanistan and could provide in the future. That's tangible leverage in the sense of being able to, in principle at least, incentivize certain behavior on the part of the Taliban if it wants to have a share in governing a country that can, provide services and that needs funding to do so. And in terms of the Afghan government's participation in the peace process as well. Obviously, both of those forms of leverage have waned considerably. I mean, troops as a sort of forcing or potentially forcing capability is something that has been dramatically on the wane for some time now. And the money is still a leverage in the sense of incentivization, but my view is that's kind of leverage at the margins. I mean, to suggest that either side in the conflict is going to give up on fundamental preferences and policy views in exchange for money, that they'll just sort of sell out for foreign money. I think it's a mistake to think that the money is that powerful when it comes to like really making compromises in a peace process. In terms of intangible leverage, and it's, these things are interlinked in a sense, there's the question of, does the United States see itself as having stakes in Afghanistan? Does it see itself as having an interest in, I don't mean interests in, I mean, like, does it care what happens in Afghanistan? And do people in the world think that it cares about what happens in Afghanistan? If you think about the US role in the Northern Ireland peace process, I mean, what real stakes did the US have there? But everyone thought the United States sort of cared about what happened there, and that gave it some leverage. And then finally, there's just the question of whether others perceive the United States to still have influence in the region, either because of its relationship with elements of the Afghan polity, because of its relationship with Pakistan, with India, the broader geopolitical dynamics. And, in that intangible sense, I would say the US still has some leverage and some capabilities, but one of the difficulties is that withdrawing the troops is kind of a way of saying we don't really care so much. I mean, we care, but we don't care so much. This is not an existential issue or anything approaching an existential issue for the United States. And so I see that there's a diminishment of this intangible leverage as well. And, it's not to say that the US shouldn't persist with the diplomacy. It absolutely should do what the administration has said it's going to do, which is try to keep up a peace process, to try to energize the regional engagement in the peace process. But I think it's, even without suggesting that troops in and of themselves are the crucial, linchpin of American leverage, I think inevitably you have to look at this decision and what it signifies in terms of this broader sense of leverage, is meaning that the US will have less, and that if US leverage is what it would take to make a peace process prosper, then the prospects have definitely diminished now.
Thanks. Let me turn to Muqaddesa and ask you, obviously, your reaction to the U.S. policy announcement generally, but maybe more specifically, I'm interested in your thoughts on the leading narrative that's come from civil society, from the Republic side, on protecting the gains. One of the main goals of the Republic is to preserve women's rights, social freedoms, free media, and so forth. How do you see that being impacted, those gains being impacted by the Biden decision? And what are some key steps that you would see as necessary in the short term to try to continue those advancements that are in the 2004 Constitution?
Thank you, Scott, for asking me that question. I actually have held a perspective on that for a very long time, but I think it probably makes more sense in the context of currently firm and unconditioned withdrawal decision. I think much of the reaction have been covered by the panelists here. So I would like to specifically go on to your question of protecting the gains. I also would like to make it clear that I am here today on my personal capacity as and more of in my political activism hat, and not necessarily in my official capacity. So
Understood.
I think much of the peace process narratives and terminologies of the past 2 years were actually born from the inherent need to justify continued military presence or to introduce certain bargaining chips that could later either define a condition or could be used to negotiate. So I personally think that protecting the gain is one such term. Because now if you put it in the context of currently firm and unconditioned withdrawal decision, I think first and foremost, it's important to note that much of the broadly talked gains of the past 20 years is actually given to our daily life. And it is the reality of the current Afghanistan. For example, I don't think any working professional Afghan woman, including myself, we wake up in the morning and we think of ourselves as gains. You know, if that sort of helps to unpack the term itself. I think that the term, the gain, is actually now made it to a set of collective values that is embodied in different aspects of our day-to-day life. Now, I also understand, you know, the very famous urban-rural polarization that also emerged as a concept around these gains. But you know what, I can tell you that life has evolved for every Afghan in the past 20 years, regardless of their geographic location or socioeconomic context. Today, a woman in a very remote village, I think, is more aware of her rights compared to her mother and demands more from life. Now, do you want to term that as gain, or do you think that is the evolved way of living, you know, in the past 20 years, or the current reality of the Afghans? So all along, I think I've always felt that the framing of the current realities of Afghanistan into gains, it has made us very vulnerable, you know, particularly women. I personally have never advocated or lobbied for protecting the rights of the Afghan woman, because I think the moment you use the term protection, it basically means that you're too afraid to lose it, and it is in the state that you think you will lose it, and it is something that is right away bargainable. So and it does put you in a weak position, you know. So I think and the other thing that it has been doing is also that it has reinforced Taliban's viewpoint of the current Afghanistan. When you term it as gains, when you term it as an aftermath of the presence of the international community in Afghanistan, by default, the Taliban tell you that, you know what, so this is not the reality of Afghanistan. It is a state of being that came with the international invasion, and it will go away once the international community withdraws, you know. So I think I have an inherent, Scott, an inherent problem with trying to coin the reality of the current Afghanistan as gains of the past 20 years. And particularly, I think now that we don't need to necessarily define conditions for military presence on the ground or justify aid spending. I think it's probably time for all of us to introduce, maybe to try to make an attempt to introduce new terminologies and vocabularies, maybe more, you know, local terminologies that probably fits the conditions on the ground, which I think takes me to your part of the question, which was about what you know, what could be probably done. Now, if I have managed to unpack my perspective on gains, you know, I also want to tell you that when President Biden spoke of not using American troops as a bargaining chip, something about that resonated here in Kabul. And that was not having your life and your existence tied to the next withdrawal announcement, or not having your existence basically used as a bargaining chip to negotiate a global security threat. because I do believe that Taliban are not only the problem of Afghanistan. I think it's much bigger than that. So as an Afghan woman, probably to not have your existence used as a bargaining chip and tied to a condition for justifying continued military presence, I think there was something about what President Biden said that resonated here as well. Now, what I said, none of that suggests, that the current reality is not in danger of setback or a complete loss, or that the way ahead is going to be easy.